Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. Today is Monday, June 24th, and we have a whole lot to catch up on today's episode. We were out on Friday because we were out at the Celtics Championship Parade. I was at least, and we just put a video up on the YouTube page as well with some highlights from the championship parade, but in that time missed out on a number of different headlines in the NBA, including JJ Redick being hired as the Lakers head coach. So we're going to dive into that, breaking down the trade between the Bulls and Thunder that exchanged Alex Caruso and Josh Giddey for one another. And then we are also going to be touching on some NBA draft topics now that draft week is officially upon us. The Cavaliers this morning signed head coach Kenny Atkinson to be the replacement for JB Bickerstaff, and we have a Game 7 tonight in the Stanley Cup Finals that I want to dive into that as well. But before we get into the show, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on all of the latest happenings in sports and try and help to make this show as interactive as possible. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, gsmcpodcast.net. If you leave a comment along with a tip or donation, it'll pop up on screen for everyone to see, and anything would be greatly appreciated on that end. So we have to start by diving into a little bit of older news in the Los Angeles Lakers, who on Thursday afternoon solidified JJ Redick to be their next head coach. And this has been a little bit of a long time coming to some degree. Redick was one of the biggest names that was thrown out there, most heavily tied to the Lakers throughout this head coaching search. Now, obviously, we had that whole sort of side quest going on where the Lakers were going after UConn's Dan Hurley, who publicly rejected them. And there was a little bit of speculation whether or not Redick would be okay with coming back into this situation after publicly it was clear that he was sort of the second option or their second choice in all of this. But ultimately, Redick does take the job. It is his first time coaching above the youth level, which definitely has some people concerned, but obviously somebody who just recently retired from the NBA, played 15 years in the league, and has been around basketball even since retiring. So his overall knowledge of the game really isn't in much question here, but is it going to be enough for the Lakers as they look to try and, I wouldn't say, it's sort of a retooling, you could say, of they have been a playoff team the past couple years. They even made the Western Conference Finals in 2023. But there are still a lot of questions as to the legitimacy of what is the ceiling with this group. You have LeBron James, you have Anthony Davis, but there are a lot of question marks outside of that. And, last year with the head coaching situation, Darvin Ham was clearly not the right person to figure out this puzzle. Also a first-time head coach there. Ham just never really seemed to have a good grasp on what the Lakers needed to do. He was playing with the rotations throughout the entirety of the year, whether or not Austin Reeves and D'Angelo Russell could coexist in a starting lineup, having their minutes sort of yanked back and forth. And that is sort of a bigger conversation as to the roster construction in general. But the point being, Ham wasn't enough. What makes us think that JJ Redick is going to be able to elevate the Lakers to this next level? Now, JJ Redick, he gets a 4-year contract with the Lakers, so he's going to seemingly have a little bit of leeway. After 4 years, we'll see if it even is still LeBron and AD in LA. But ultimately, regardless, the idea right now for the Lakers is that they are trying to win this season. And again, I'm curious behind closed doors what those conversations exactly look like in terms of expectations, because I really don't think that Darvin Ham, for as much criticism as he received, I don't think he underachieved necessarily with the Lakers. He was given 2 years. He, both years, a low seed, which is definitely part of the conversation, but made the Western Conference Finals and, still made the playoffs the next year. Now, in both of those series combined that they ended up going out in, they only took 1 out of 9 games, so that's not ideal, of course, but again, it's a question as to whether or not JJ can actually change any of those results. Now, what Redick does bring is, I think that respect is going to be something much easier for him to grasp than it ever was for Darvin Ham. When you talk about a coach coming in with having no head coach experience in the past, and especially in JJ's position here, where his only other coaching history is with a youth team, that is typically a very tough obstacle to overcome, especially when you have some greats on your team, let alone LeBron James, one of, if not the most accomplished basketball player in the history of the game. But because of the fact that LeBron and JJ have been doing these podcasts together, it's a little bit of a running joke for the internet. But at the same time, I do think that there's going to be a real respect between LeBron and Redick, where it would be very easy for LeBron to sort of steamroll any first-time head coach and just make it his team. JJ Redick is somebody that I think that he is going to have extensive respect from LeBron James that's going to trickle down the rest of the organization. So that's something that I think is a very big plus. And it's because of the fact that he has very clear knowledge of the modern game in the NBA, considering the fact that he played in the NBA for 15 years, just retired in 2021, and since then has been around the league. So all of these are positive things. I think that JJ Redick does have very good potential to be a successful head coach in the NBA. But I still have reservations in terms of, does this actually solve anything for the Lakers? Where anybody who thinks that Darvin Ham was the sole reason the Lakers lost to the Nuggets last year, I think they're lying to themselves. Maybe if the Lakers had a better regular season, they could have avoided running into the Nuggets in the first round for sure. But either way, I don't think that they were a top 3 team in the Western Conference, and in fact, would definitively say they're not. I know a lot of people, you can interpret it however you'd like, but I believe that the Nuggets, the Mavericks, and the Timberwolves were all definitively better than the Lakers this past year. And, when you're talking about the regular season success and how that inflects upon Darvin Ham, the easiest possible path for them in the playoffs would have been probably them losing that first play-in tournament game and ending up as the 8th seed to play an inexperienced Oklahoma City. Now, you can debate whether or not the Lakers would have had, I think the Lakers would have had a chance against the Thunder. We saw the regular season matchups. It was clear that OKC didn't necessarily have the size in the postseason. It seemed like the Mavericks in that Western Conference semifinal series, every big rebound went the other way. So maybe the Lakers could have, come out of the first round possibly and upset the Thunder, but I think that ultimately the Lakers weren't doing anything this season that was going to be that substantial. And that's because what we saw in the first round when they played the Nuggets was that it was LeBron James and Anthony Davis versus Nikola Jokic, and really a little bit of Jamal Murray, a lot of inconsistency for him in the first round and in the postseason in general. Michael Porter Jr. was actually, the legitimate number 2 option in terms of his efficiency and his scoring output and everything in that series, but it was, outside of the star players, the main core, what do you have? And the Lakers were just entirely outclassed outside of their top 2, where they never really stood a chance. And I would say that in this past playoffs, there was a little bit of a theme in terms of what can you get from your other guys, where more so than ever, and you talk about the Celtics championship in particular, where Jason Tatum is, in my eyes, the best player on the team, but he's not a consensus top 3, top 4. He may not even be top 5 player in the NBA. And you have Jaylen Brown, of course, who's another star in that top 15 to 20 range as well, but not your traditional, star power takeover in the finals. And we saw Tatum and even Brown too, as the playoffs went on, take on a little bit more playmaking responsibilities because they could trust their teammates to knock down these shots. And then you look at the other teams that were powered by their stars throughout the postseason, the Mavericks with Luka, the Timberwolves with Anthony Edwards, even the Knicks with Jalen Brunson. Each of these other teams, we saw incredible individual runs, but why did their teams get knocked out of the playoffs? It was because there wasn't enough help. Because, for Brunson and Luka, their bodies were physically wearing down. Anthony Edwards, inexperienced at just 22 years old, he was exhausted, it looked, and mentally fatigued almost as well by the end of that Western Conference Finals, where, I think that when you tie this back to the Lakers, outside of their top 2, what were their real options? Now, Austin Reeves is somebody that I think is interesting because he went from being a little bit overrated when he first emerged onto the scene, and now I do think he goes a little bit underappreciated. He is a good player, a baseline good role player that the Lakers very much need. But, even outside of that, if he's your third star, that's a little bit of an issue in its own. And then the fact that after Austin Reeves, there really wasn't anything going for the Lakers where they couldn't get help on either side of the ball. It's one thing when you have even a Jared Vanderbilt, who of course spent the playoffs injured. He might have returned at the end of the playoffs. I don't think so, though, at the end of that series, that is. But out of the 8 players who actually got playing time for the Lakers in that first round, half of them shot under 40% from the field, which is just miserable. You can't have that because it gets to this point where, teams are solely locking in on your stars. And again, if you want to sort of talk an overall theme here in the playoffs, for the Celtics, they were fully abandoning shooters other than Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving when they were trying to shoot from above the break, and they were willing to live with whatever shots went down. Spoiler alert, the majority of them didn't go in. And, the Mavericks are probably going to be out shopping for maybe some supplementary role players. The Lakers absolutely need to as well, because they right now are sort of without depth, or not even that they're top heavy, because it's just those two. It's not even like they have a third star if you're going the sort of super team built model. The Lakers have a lot of issues still, and I do like JJ Redick as a head coaching candidate. Now, I feel like he would be better off probably with an organization that isn't immediately, in the pressure cooker just based off of the job title alone of being the Los Angeles Lakers head coach. But also, again, I'm really curious what those conversations behind the scenes are with the Lakers and JJ Redick during this negotiation of, I wouldn't say a leash necessarily, because JJ Redick understands that this job comes with pressure and that he's going to need to succeed. But what were sort of the parameters of him taking this job? What is viewed as an unsuccessful season? Because I look at the Western Conference, and I mentioned the 3 teams that were definitively better than them in the Mavericks, the Timberwolves, and the Nuggets. Then you add in here Oklahoma City is only going to be better next year, I would have to imagine, at least from a playoff standpoint. Number 1 seed last year, which is impressive, but ultimately we know it's all about the playoffs. They have that additional experience, already made a roster move that is going to improve them for next year. I really do think that people have sort of forgotten about the Memphis Grizzlies when they return with Ja Morant and whatever you can get out of Marcus Smart still at his point in his career. They're likely going to go out and look for a big option. If they could get like a Nick Claxton, or if they somehow even find their way into Donovan Clingan in the NBA draft that we're going to be talking about very shortly, I I feel like those are, you get a true big man in that locker room as well. I feel like they're going to be a scary team. And you can go on with a number of these different organizations in the West. It is a deep conference. And I struggle to believe that the Lakers are going to be able to fully correct it. But let me know what your thoughts are in the comments section. I would be happy to answer any questions. But we are going to be taking our first break here. I'm going to be diving into some questions around the NBA draft, as the draft week is officially here. We're just a couple days away, so I want to dive into some of the latest buzz on that. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my sound. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news if it's some moosey shit. A stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are going to be now diving into some thoughts surrounding the NBA draft. It is just a couple days away now. The first round is on Wednesday, the 26th. The second round is on Thursday, the 27th. This is the first year that the NBA has decided to break up the draft day into two separate segments. A little bit of a weird concept to me. Definitely trying to go after the NFL draft sort of sequencing here. I think it's a little bit ridiculous, especially considering the reputation surrounding this draft in particular does sort of hurt the overall appeal of what we're going to see. But at the same time, there's a good chance Bronny James is going to be hanging around when that second round arrives. So there are going to be things that will have content to talk about. But the latest sort of drama surrounding the number one overall pick is that the Hawks have supposedly been unable to get Alex Sarr in for a workout. Sarr, for really specifically around when the lottery happened, Alex Sarr was seen as the favorite to be the number one overall pick. It was seen that way for a while, but Brian Windhorst and Jonathan Givony of ESPN reported that Sarr would actually prefer to play for the Wizards than with the Hawks, and that it's not quite a 2003 NFL draft situation where you have an Eli Manning who's going to refuse to play for one team in particular, but Sarr, who was seen as the number one overall prospect for a lot of this process, he is actively trying to avoid being drafted to Atlanta and end up in Washington. Now, he wouldn't refuse playing for Atlanta, but it's definitely a preferred landing spot, and I would have to imagine that is probably about having the opportunity for himself individually to be able to thrive, where Sarr is, if he ends up in Atlanta, he's playing with Trae Young and DeJounte Murray. The shots aren't necessarily his for the taking. He has to slide into a, third option type role. That's assuming that the Hawks do continue to move forward here with both Trae Young and DeJounte Murray, which it kind of sounds like that might be the case. Now, I've been on record in the past saying that I do believe that they need to shake up their roster of some sorts, but it's neither here nor there. If you are Sarr, you understand that it's probably the majority of Sarr's looks are going to be generated off of Trae Young action, which is nice sometimes. We saw in the past, even Clint Capella, who is definitely on a downwards trajectory at this point in his career, he largely benefited from having a James Harden as he was coming up as a big, and having Trae Young as well, where Harden, I would say more so than Young, did a tremendous job of getting him open looks at the rim, with him being a rim runner, throwing the lobs and such. And Sarr believes personally, as it feels like any NBA prospect should to some degree, feels like he can provide more than just that type of a role. And going to Washington, I mean, we know the current situation around the Wizards. Now, I do think that there are maybe a couple building blocks, the main one being Denny Avdia, who isn't really a number one option in his own right either. So Sarr would get a lot more opportunities in Washington to sort of establish himself during these rookie years, grow as a player, as opposed to being put in a pretty stagnant situation in Atlanta, where we know the Hawks are a mediocre team. Sometimes they look a little bit better, sometimes they look a little bit worse, but ultimately you figure they're going to end up around the 500 mark. And if you're not going to be ultra competitive anyways, Sarr wants to be in a position where he can actually thrive individually as a talent. Now, it's not that the Washington Wizards franchise is this, team organization that has been incredible at developing youth talent over the years, that they've been these great drafters or anything. But at the same time, again, you can't necessarily look at it from that perspective. You just have to think that Sarr is somebody who has been highly touted for the majority of his playing career. He was one of the biggest names in the Overtime Elite League when he played in America briefly in 2022-23, one of those years before going back to France this past year. And now he is sort of come into this position where you still do have questions about some of the shooting upside, but there's at least an idea that on the ball he can be a little bit of an X factor in terms of what he can provide you offensively from that standpoint. And it wouldn't be bad for him, I think, by any means, to go out and just sort of, get those types of opportunities early on in his career. Ultimately, he's going to end up where he's going to end up, but it seems like he might be sliding a little bit more into the 2 spot, as Donovan Clingan has continued to impress just about every team that he's worked out for up to this point. And especially with the reputation surrounding this year's draft, in terms of, we really don't know if there's going to be an all-NBA caliber star. You kind of have to, the way that it's been framed in a couple different ways is that it's almost like you have to imagine the number 1 overall pick this year is the number 7 overall pick in years prior. And Donovan Clingan is going to be a productive NBA player to some capacity in my analysis, where I think he does a ton right. We know about the defensive intensity, obviously drops off a little bit when he's on the perimeter, but still can hold his own to some degree. He is tremendous in the pick and roll. I think he has incredible hands, and sort of when I think about the idea of him being drafted number 1 overall, I go back to 2018, where DeAndre Ayton was taken number 1 overall, and he's been solid, I would say, up to this point. I don't think he's a bust necessarily, because he's a semi-productive, at times he's looked really good, but the issue is that you have the Luka Doncic's and the Trae Youngs being selected after him that make that pick look so much worse. And there's a number of other players in that 2018 draft as well. But again, if you're sort of cutting out the idea that there are these, especially with Luka, I still think it's one of the craziest things ever that the Suns didn't take him number 1 overall. They had, I'm blanking on his last name, it was Igor, whatever. He had actually coached Luka overseas. It was his first year in Phoenix. He easily could have, gave the Suns the intel needed to take him, but instead they go with Ayton, and the rest is sort of history there. But when I look at Clingan, I see no reason why he can't be just as successful as DeAndre Ayton, and maybe even have a little bit of a higher upside based off of the difference in motor that we've seen from Ayton throughout his young NBA career, and the way that we've seen Donovan Clingan and really all of those Huskies from last season be just grinders on the court of never really letting up. We've just seen these mental lapses with Ayton that I don't think are going to be the same in Clingan's game. So there really isn't much evidence to support the idea that Clingan can eventually be a stretch 5 in the NBA. Now, who knows? But when you look at the free throw shooting, typically a good indicator of, if there is any upside. Clingan just never even really attempted shots from the perimeter, so, we'll see whether or not that does ever come into play. I wouldn't count on it, but I also wouldn't let it hold me back if I am the Hawks in terms of trying to make a run here at Clingan, and that's anybody that needs a big man, especially, again, I mentioned, the Memphis Grizzlies, who are going to be at the top of the draft order. It's going to be, I would say, definitely out of range here, but if the Thunder were to be able to package some stuff and move up to get Donovan Clingan, I think that there are some really good fits there, and Clingan is somebody who can succeed in a lot of environments. Now, is he ever going to be a 20-point per game scorer? I wouldn't bank on it, but again, it's interesting when you combine this number 1 overall draft status in comparison to, this year as it is to years prior. I think you're just going to have to take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, but it definitely sounds like Clingan is moving up the boards, and he's been massively impressive in these workouts up to this point. And the last report, I guess we're going a little bit big man heavy today, that I wanted to touch on was that the Ringer reported this morning that Zach Edey could be taken with the 7th overall pick to the Portland Trailblazers, which I find to be another very interesting situation, and you have to keep into perspective all the things we just talked about in terms of there very likely is not a superstar caliber player in this draft. Now, I still feel like for the Trailblazers, they have a lot of unknowns. Anthony Simons is a great guard. They have Scoot Henderson as well. So ideally, you think you have your backcourt of the future. But even there, some unknowns, probably more so with Scoot than there is with Simons, even though Simons' injuries are definitely becoming a little bit of an early theme of his career up to this point. You have a lot of openings on that team, and I do think that there are more impactful players than Edey that are going to be available at number 7. Now, Edey can probably carve out a role for himself. I don't think that, this idea that he has no skill, I don't subscribe to that, but I don't fully see how it translates to the NBA, and I would have hesitations there. Edey being a lottery pick, I can name 10 prospects that I like more than him, so I don't feel great about it, but again, you do have to understand that if there is a role that he can hold, even if it's talking about just somebody who can consistently be a backup big man for, a decade, that might be what you're shooting for here with the number 7 overall pick, considering that there is not a, top consensus tier of players who are going to be massively impactful. But we're going to definitely come to you with some mock drafts as the week goes on here. I just wanted to give some thoughts on the very latest buzz, but we do have an actual definitive trade that we have to dive into, where last week we saw Alex Caruso be traded for Josh Giddey as the Bulls and Thunder came to a deal, and I have some thoughts on it that I don't know necessarily if it's reflected by the general consensus in terms of whether or not the Bulls were fleeced. So we are going to be diving into that, but first a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. The trade broke last Thursday that the Chicago Bulls finally, after years of stagnancy, are making a move, and yet still not a lot of excitement surrounding what took place for Chicago. So this took place on Thursday afternoon. It is just a 1-for-1 deal. The Thunder are sending Chicago Josh Giddey in exchange for Alex Caruso. And when this broke out, immediately everybody on social media started killing the Bulls for this deal, considering the fact that they are buying in on Josh Giddey after his value is never been lower since he entered the NBA, and I think he was the 2021 draft, the 6th overall pick, and in exchange, they gave up a fan favorite role player in Alex Caruso, who has had back-to-back all defensive seasons. Not to mention the fact that Caruso, at age 30, showed that he has some maybe offensive, at least he's improving on his offensive upside, averaged a career high in points per game with a career high field goal percentage. So again, a 1-for-1 deal here. I do think that, considering the fact that Oklahoma City has all of this extra draft capital, people were really mad that the Bulls couldn't get any sort of draft compensation in exchange for this deal, when ultimately, I do think when you look at the two player profiles, it didn't necessarily warrant an extra pick alongside a young piece for an older player in Alex Caruso, who is going to be on an expiring contract this year, and they're going to have to pay right away. But again, the fact that the Thunder have all of these extra draft picks make it seem like maybe the Bulls should have gotten something there, at least somewhere in the negotiation process, get even a second round pick in there. But that is probably an unfair way to view this. But this is the first player-for-player trade the Bulls have made since 2021. At that point, I believe it was the Lauri Markkanen deal or Nikola Vucevic. It was one of those. So we're going on years where the Bulls have not acquired a player in a trade. And again, the overall perception of this is you are moving on from a fan favorite in exchange for somebody who has some potential character issues. Now, we're not going to dive into all of the off-the-court stuff with Josh Giddey, but he was, again, believe what you would like out of it. He was ruled innocent, no punishment from the NBA or law enforcement, but I do think that incident absolutely has a big impact on the way that we view this trade. And it's something that you are very fair to consider, but if we're talking just from a basketball standpoint, I actually like this deal for the Bulls a lot more than sounds like the majority of people do. People are very caught up on the fact that, especially, this has just been a disastrous year for Giddey, where he had the off-the-court issues, and the last time we saw him, he was borderline unplayable against the Mavericks in the conference semifinals. But I think that if you can look past that to the point where, Giddey had sort of been outshined in his original situation where he was supposed to come in as the true point guard for Oklahoma City. He was going to be an on-the-ball guy, and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, rightfully so, because he is miles better than Giddey, but SGA sort of came in and took away that responsibility, and Giddey had to be a little bit of a stand in the corner guy. And that was just never going to work. We understand the shooting is a massive weakness for Giddey, so that's why when you look at the Mavericks series, he was almost the perfect player for the Mavericks to go up against, where their whole defensive strategy was, we're going to protect the paint and we are going to massively help off of a non-shooter to put our center just camping in the paint. And that's exactly what they did. Giddey never made them pay, and it wasn't just him. We also saw, that Thunder team that was incredible three-point shooting during the regular season. They just didn't necessarily have that in this series, and it was just a really bad look for Giddey, and it was clear that they were going to have to part ways. Now, it sounds like behind the scenes, what sort of forced this deal to get done is the Thunder had proposed that Josh Giddey was going to come off of the bench next year as the sixth man, and Giddey he wasn't bought in on that idea. He wanted to be traded, and for the Thunder, I think everybody is consensus agreement that this is a pretty great deal for the Thunder, where you add, an elite perimeter defender and somebody who can knock down his open looks in exchange for a piece that clearly didn't fit into what they were trying to run there last season. And, they needed a little bit more of some veteran presence possibly. And again, Giddey is going into his age 22 season. So as much as it's an upgrade for the Thunder, I like, at least, it depends on where the Bulls choose to go from here. If they commit to a rebuild, though, I see no reason why Josh Giddey can't be a centerpiece of what they continue to build. Like, Giddey, as an on-the-ball, ball handler in terms of his playmaking and everything, and I know there's the clip of, his errant passes that's going viral right now, but Giddey was a really good player for his first couple years, and at 22 years old, I'm just not going to be ready to fully write him off, especially after seeing a bunch of the high flashes. Now, again, it depends on what the Bulls are going to do here, because they have been content with being mediocre for a number of years now. It's almost like the organization just wants to continue selling out tickets because they're in Chicago. They know they have an extremely loyal fan base. They're in the conversation as to making the playoffs, but 2 years in a row now, they have exited in the play-in tournament, which is disappointing. Of course, if you're a Bulls fan, I'm sure you're entirely frustrated with it. Just pick a direction. And I do think that this is a step in the right direction for the Bulls if they are going to choose and commit to playing out a rebuild here, where there's a ton of top-end talent actually in the 2025 class. Obviously, if you're a Bulls fan, you don't want to be thinking about 2025 rookies right now, but do you want to think about another 3 years of watching DeRozan, LaVine, and Vucevic playing alongside one another? I just don't think that that's going to get you anywhere. Now, DeMar is an upcoming free agent, so for the right price, I still think DeRozan is a productive NBA player and that he can fit in and contribute to winning basketball in a number of different places. Now, as good as some of the clutch stats were, I also felt like last year it was driving me a little bit crazy how much everything revolved around him, and yet there were a number of times where he was able to shine. So I don't know, I just feel like I can see that translating to an actual winning team other than this mediocre Bulls team. And you probably want to dump Vucevic as well. Zach LaVine, on the contract that he's currently on, maybe it sounds like they've been making calls relentlessly to try and make sure that to try and dump LaVine, get anything they can for him, and potentially lean into this rebuild idea. Now, with LaVine coming off of this injury, his stock has probably never been lower, and unlike Giddey, who's on this rookie deal, who now the Bulls are going to have control over for the next 5 to 6 seasons if they would like to, with Levine, he is 30 years old-ish, and he has all of these years at an extremely expensive price, and no team is going to be just sort of semi-willing to take that on, especially under this new CBA where you get penalized so heavily for the second threshold of the luxury tax situation. So that he's probably somebody they look to move, if they are going to move him, around the trade deadline or so, hope that he can build up some of that stock once again. But I really don't mind this trade whatsoever for the Bulls. Again, I understand for PR purposes, for a couple different reasons, it is not a super exciting move, especially when you're coming off of 3 years now, basically, where they haven't made an actual trade in terms of, acquiring a player. That it definitely feels like it's a little underwhelming when you have zero draft capital attached when you're making a deal with the team that has basically half the league's draft capital. But still, I stand by the Bulls just need to pick a direction. And Josh Giddey, if that's your rebuilding plan, I really do think that there is something there. Now, how he's going to fit in with Kobe White, Ayo Dosunmu, is definitely a question there, because there's a number of, semi-talented guards there already. And again, I'm not saying that the full blueprint is laid out in front of us yet, but if the Bulls can actually pick a direction here, and I'm not saying they need to entirely blow up the whole thing, if things end up working out there, I mean, we've seen Giddey play winning basketball before, and so be it, but they need to actually find a way to, get out of this sub 500 pattern where they are just going out in the play-in tournament and kind of putting their fan base through it, because the Chicago Bulls organization should be more than that. And I think it's fun when they are relevant, but that just hasn't been the case in a number of years now. And I think that this is maybe the right step. As for the Thunder, very quickly here, like I talked about, I'm definitely a fan of this deal for the Thunder. I think he plays in perfectly to what they're trying to do. They're a team that, yes, they're young, they can shoot and everything, but it is the switchability that they have and the number of different defenders they can put out there. No weak spots, sort of built similar to the Celtics. You bring in Alex Caruso, and maybe he's a little bit older than Derek White when the Celtics traded for that, but that's kind of the similarity here where you can point to that. I think he's going to be excellent for OKC, and the Thunder, I still feel like they are probably a move or two away from being, favorites in that Western Conference. I think that they need to address the big man position one way or another, at least to have a backup option behind Chet, but I am definitely sold on what that organization is doing, and also considering the fact that, for whatever it's worth, they didn't give up any picks. They didn't necessarily get bullied into, oh, well, you have all these picks anyways, just throw one in there with it. That's not how this works. Sam Presti is one of the best general managers in the NBA, and I thought they made out really well yet again. But let me know what your thoughts on that are. We're going to be moving on to a hire that took place this morning. We talked about JJ Redick to the Lakers earlier in the show. This time it is the Cleveland Cavaliers who have just hired their replacement after firing JB Bickerstaff at the end of the playoffs this year. So we're going to be diving into that. Stick with us and we will be right back. Don't go anywhere.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. as we mentioned earlier in the show, we talked about JJ Redick being hired by the Los Angeles Lakers. This morning, we got word that the Cleveland Cavaliers are hiring Warriors assistant Kenny Atkinson to be their next head coach. They had just fired JB Bickerstaff after the team lost in the Eastern Conference semifinals, and now they are bringing in somebody who does have a little bit of experience. Atkinson was with the Brooklyn Nets as their head coach from 2016 to 2020. He ended up getting fired right before that the COVID situation kicked in and everything. And since then, he has been serving as an assistant with the Warriors. Now, he actually almost was signed by the Hornets. I think he briefly agreed to be their head coach after he was fired there, and then ultimately he backed out of it. Has had some learning experiences under Steve Kerr in this Warriors front office, and now, I mean, all things considered, a much better situation to come into in Cleveland than if he were to go to Charlotte. No offense, Hornets fans, but, you know, a lot more overall talent on the roster, and it's still going to be difficult, I think, for the Cavaliers to figure out how they want to play this whole thing. Now, it sounds like they are getting towards a place where they can actually re-sign Donovan Mitchell to a contract extension. That has been a big question, really, ever since the Cavaliers traded for him when we knew this expiring contract was eventually coming. But The Athletic reported that they are confident that they're going to be able to re-sign Mitchell. They have a 4-year extension for him worth $209 million on the table that they believe is going to be enough to get him to stay. And that would obviously be massive for the Cavaliers, where Mitchell, I mean, we saw the types of performances that he was putting on last year to get the Cavaliers even to where they were in the second round. His incredible performances in games 6 and 7 of their first round series against the Magic, and then he was a massive factor scoring wise in those first couple games of the Boston series in the next round. And it seems like for the Cavaliers, you know, Donovan Mitchell, is he this flawless superstar? No, but he is absolutely in that top tier of players that can continue to make you competitive. Your floor is always going to be higher when you have a player like him on the court. Now, it's going to be a question as to how to balance him and Darius Garland, where that is one of the other big questions with this organization, is how are they going to be able to balance the 4 players that they have in Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland for starters there, where just a couple weeks ago we had reports that Darius Garland could potentially ask out if Donovan Mitchell does sign this long-term deal. Now, there's been a little bit of refuting that to the public, but we won't have any definitive answers really until we see what happens with Mitchell in these contract negotiations with the Cavaliers. Now, if I'm the Cavs, I am leaning towards keeping Mitchell as opposed to Garland. Now, I'm not out on Garland by any means. He is still another very young player that should have a bright upside for years to come. He already was an all-star once, and I think it was 21 or 22. It was right before Mitchell came over in that deal with Utah. And I think that, you know, for the Cavs in this situation, Garland is an awesome piece, and I know that the stock on him is probably a little bit lower because he really struggled in the playoffs this year. But another situation, we just talked about Giddey in the last segment, where, you know, everybody's so down on him, his value's at an all-time low. Garland is in a similar situation. I think that Garland has a higher chance of being, you know, the sole centerpiece of a rebuild with a team, but, you know, he struggled with a fractured jaw during the regular season, and then he came back, and he's just never been comfortable alongside Mitchell. And I do think that Mitchell, we saw some of the flashes of it in that series. I believe it was, I think it was against the Magic at the end of that series, but a little bit in the Boston series as well, where Mitchell was extremely supportive of Garland, saying, I need you to be a part of this with me. And again, the results never necessarily were there, but I do think that it can be a repairable relationship if they both want to make it work. Now, developing some sort of way to have them be able to play off of each other maybe a little bit more is something that is still to be seen in terms of off-ball creation. What are they going to do in terms of, are they going to stagger their minutes and whatnot? It's going to be a job for Kenny Atkinson to be able to try and solve this issue. It's interesting because when you look at Atkinson's history, at least as a head coach when he was with the Nets, there were a number of different guards during those years where, you know, they were balancing one another, and they aren't. It was D'Angelo Russell when he made the All-Star game when he was with the Nets. Karis LeVert was playing really well at that time. Same with Spencer Dinwiddie. It was these three guards that were all sort of sharing looks and opportunities, and it balanced out really well. So I wonder if there is anything that Kenny Atkinson can take from that to put it in this situation here. Also, you know, you talk about he also just spent some years with the Warriors as well, one of the most collaborative teams, one of the more unselfish teams in recent NBA history. Maybe there's something to that as well, but it's obviously only one half of the issue. Jared Allen and Evan Mobley is the other part of that, where Mobley, unless he's going to become a stretch big, which I do think that there are some things you can point to in terms of whether or not he will ever be able to develop a little bit more range to his game, I still just don't see necessarily how you are able to fit the two of them together. Now, this might be a situation where Cleveland, they understand they have these 4 all-star caliber players, and they just want to see if under a new head coach they can make things work, and maybe they kick the can a little bit further down the road. Maybe that's the way to go about it. I think that, you know, if it weren't for Atkinson coming into this situation, I would say 100% you have to move at least one of them, probably at least 2 of them. Now, I don't want to necessarily, you know, push anybody out the door before, you know, if Kenny Atkinson feels confident that he can make it work. Again, there's a ton of talent on the roster. Might be worth giving it a try. I just feel like we sort of know how this is going to play out. So maybe it's a trade deadline situation as well. It does feel less likely that if Donovan Mitchell is able to get this contract extension done, which the Cavaliers think that they can, that this is probably going to be mostly the makeup of what the Cavaliers are going to run into next season with. And again, I don't know if necessarily that is the right move. You let me know in the comments section whether or not you agree with it or not. But it is interesting to say the least. And I think that ultimately Kenny Atkinson's a good hire here, where I thought that they were going to end up with Borrego, but again, having somebody with who's been desirable for a number of years from a head coaching standpoint, has experience and, you know, has had some successful seasons on his own, and has also been a part of a championship winning organization when he was with the Warriors in 2022. Definitely not a bad thing to have here for Cleveland, so you got to respect that. Now, this does leave, I could talk more on the Cavaliers here, but I feel like we've done that a number of times throughout this offseason so far, and I'm going to try and limit those conversations until we actually get some new developments there. But this does leave the Detroit Pistons as the only team left with a head coaching vacancy. They came to the party a little bit late as they waited until after the finals to fire Monty Williams, and now they are coming into this head coaching search. You know, for them, I do think that there are a number of interesting candidates that are out there for them. I think I saw that they chose to interview Sean Sweeney the other day over the weekend. That might have been something that they looked into. That was a name that I mentioned the other day last week when we talked about this coaching search. Sweeney with the Mavericks for the past couple years, top assistant there. Could be interesting. But, you know, ultimately here for the Pistons, they can take their time in this decision now. There are going to be a lot of sort of more veteran options out there, I would say. And, for them, they're still so far away from being able to contend, but I've said it before. I think that they do have legitimate cornerstones available to them. Cade Cunningham, Jaden Ivey, Jalen Duren, plus whatever you can get out of an Asar Thompson. And, now they have the 5th overall pick in this draft too, whether they choose to actually use it or go out and try and bring in some veteran talent as well. They have at least, I think, a path where they can be back to not winning 14 games, to say the least, but back to, semi relevance in the coming years. But let me know who you think they should go after in the comment section. We're going to be taking our final break of the show, though, and when we come back, we're going to be switching some gears into the NHL. We have the 2 best words in sports taking place tonight, Game 7. The Oilers trailed 0-3 in the series and are now back in Florida for this final showdown, so we're going to be diving into that after this quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, as we are going to be previewing a Game 7, as on Saturday night, the Edmonton Oilers this was Friday night? The Oilers forced a Game 7 in the Stanley Cup Finals with their 5-1 victory over the Florida Panthers. And this has just been so much fun to watch unravel, as the Oilers were down 0-3 in this series. Of course, we had 2 pretty uncompetitive series, it seemed like, in the finals between this Stanley Cup Finals and the NBA Finals. And instead, this series has turned on its head. Sergei Bobrovsky finally looks like a mortal once again, and the Oilers have been able to rattle off 3 straight wins. I would say, in a brief standpoint, the difference in goaltending has been the biggest change here, where I defended Stuart Skinner through the first handful of losses as well, but it did seem like for Skinner, who was somebody that was getting very heavily questioned throughout his postseason run with the Oilers, that he was the main reason why I chose to go with the Panthers over the Oilers, is because there was just a level of unknown with Skinner, as opposed to Bobrovsky, who is playing some of the best hockey of his life in the Eastern Conference Finals and really the playoffs as a whole, but especially dueling Igor Shesterkin of the Rangers and being able to come out on top in that one was extremely impressive. And now Skinner had his back up against the ropes a number of times here throughout this postseason, as recently as the second round when they trailed 3-2 against the Canucks. He has played his best hockey in those types of games where there's been pretty much no margin for error, and it's just really encouraging to see for him the way that he's been able to turn around this postseason. And again, Bobrovsky, who had gone 12 of 13 games, I believe it was, to start this postseason, allowing 2 goals or less, and now we're looking at 3 straight where he has allowed more than that, and it brings us to Game 7 in Florida. This is actually, interestingly enough, going to be the first Game 7 in all of American sports since COVID took place. So among the in the finals, I should say specifically. But Stanley Cup Finals, NBA Finals, the World Series, none of them have gone 7 games since COVID. And now, I mean, you're talking about a situation where obviously this one's in Florida. You know, fans are absolutely back, and it starts with the Oilers. I mean, just such an incredible atmosphere there in Edmonton that it's for almost their crowd alone, their must see. And then you take into consideration as well the fact that Connor McDavid, the best player in hockey, is on that side. But speaking of these best players, I thought that it was an incredibly important game on Friday night for Leon Draisaitl, who was just absolutely tremendous in that first period. He was in on the play, the goal in the first period from Warren Foegele, and they're going to need Draisaitl to, come through here. They also got a Zach Hyman goal as well in the second period of this game. Hyman's been the leading goal scorer of the playoffs so far. He had 1 goal in Game 5 that sort of came on, you can say to some degree, a little bit of a fluke, where it was off of I think it was the Bouchard slap shot at the top of the zone that just sort of happened to, not even off of his stick, but just off of his elbow, end up finding its way into the back of the net there. So good to see Hyman get on the board as well, and this Oilers team just seems like it is, really hitting its stride here at the biggest possible moment. And ultimately, on the other side of this, it was probably after that Game 5 that the pressure was really on Florida. Now, going back into that Edmonton crowd in Game 6 seemed like it was going to be a very tall task anyways, but still, now to be back here in Game 7, they are very tense. It's clear from, Maurice, the way that he's been talking to the press since then. And I do actually want to go back briefly here to Game 6, where the biggest play there was the Oilers deciding to challenge the offsides call on the Barkov goal that would have made the game 3-1 and would have kept it a little bit more alive. And especially coming right off of an Edmonton goal would have been a huge shift in that game, but instead, just by inches, it was offsides. It's one that Paul Maurice said he would have never challenged in that instance, and ultimately the Oilers end up getting it there. That was really the biggest moment where it seemed like there was some doubt that the Panthers could potentially, win this in a heartbreaking way against the Oilers, but ultimately, that goes the other way, and I know that a lot of people aren't necessarily thrilled with making that call in that moment. We have this argument, it feels like, in sports just about every other week of how can you make that call in that moment. It was the right call, and I'm very glad that the refs decided to let it slide in that moment, and let the play go on, because there's no way the human eye in that moment was going to be able to properly distinguish that was offsides. But it was a great call to challenge there. And for Edmonton, it really helps that they have a dominant penalty kill as well, that even if you get it wrong, Florida scored, I believe it's just 1 goal on, we're maybe looking at 19 tries now in this series. It's something along those lines, and it's just been, unbelievable. Special teams was going to be the key of this series, and, we talked about whether or not Edmonton's power play was officially back after Game 5, where they scored 2 there. They went 0-for on the power play on Friday night. So, again, neither power play has necessarily had all too much success in this series, but, Edmonton just looks, untouchable in terms of their penalty kill, and that's really hurt, the Panthers, because on the other end, they've just had a couple slips, and not just that, but they have allowed multiple shorthanded goals along the way as well. And so when you're being outscored while on the man advantage, that's obviously a recipe for disaster. And I think that it's going to take some, heroics on the power play to try and, flip this thing tonight. But really interesting to see. Odds are even right now between these two teams, so you can go on the majority of sports books, and that's what you will find. And ultimately, it's a pick'em at this point. And the fact that McDavid was held with 0 points in Game 6, and they were still able to, semi-handedly win that game, obviously benefit from a couple empty netters in the third period that makes the score look a little bit more out of reach than it initially, it was for the most part in this game. But, McDavid chasing these records feels like now at this point, the breaking the Gretzky record of 47 points in a single postseason is off the table. But again, that was never top of the mind for Connor McDavid. It has been all about winning. And the Oilers are now knocking on the door here, and should be really exciting to see. Again, I don't think that there is a better program right now that would be fit to take this 0-3 comeback all the way. I've just been such a huge fan of everything that Edmonton has put out there on the ice throughout this postseason run. And that, all of that being said, I do feel like there is a level of pride that the Panthers aren't necessarily given credit to, where last year it was all about this unfinished business because they ended up beating the record regular season Bruins and going all the way to the finals, only to get, I don't know if curb stomped is the right way to put it, obviously, but they lose that series pretty handedly, and they come back and build up this massive lead. We know this is an incredible hockey team, that there's a reason they were in this position. There's a reason that they were up 3-0 to start this series. They are really good, but we just haven't necessarily seen either the star power necessarily come through in the way that they have up to this point. We've seen the defensive breakdowns. Again, little stuff, but when you get burned on multiple shorthanders because of the over-aggression, I mean, we have seen the Panthers be so aggressive all, the past couple postseasons, and they can't abandon that process all throughout, but they're definitely playing tight right now, and I do give them a good shot here at home, just sort of reset. But from a fan viewing perspective, I would love to see Connor McDavid be the first person to come back down 0-3 in the Stanley Cup Finals in the modern era. Obviously happened in the 40s as well with the Toronto Maple Leafs, but this has a really special chance here, and it's going to be the biggest thing in the sports world tonight is this Game 7 matchup. So stick with us tomorrow, as we will be giving you a recap of a Stanley Cup Finals winner. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe. Be sure to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. But we will be back tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock Eastern, and we will see you then. Take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.